Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm delighted to welcome you to another one of UNU-INWEH's Science Talks. I'd like to remind you that this talk, along with all others, is being recorded, and the recording will be shared after the event. We'd also like to remind you that all of this year's previous talks, as well as the entire 2024 series with Professor Grace Oluwasanya, is available on our website at unu.edu/science-talks with an S. Today's speaker is Professor Tafadzwanashe Mabhaudhi, who is a globally recognized researcher and science advocate working at the intersection of water, energy, food, and environmental systems, bridging science, policy, and society. Professor Mabhaudhi has a strong record of scientific leadership, capacity building, and partnership development with a mission to drive research that informs policy, promotes equity, and supports transformation in Africa and beyond. At UNU-INWEH, Professor Mabhaudhi leads the Water, Energy, Food, and Environment Nexus portfolio, where he is spearheading the establishment of the UNU-INWEH African Academy on Water, Environment, and Health. This includes building a consortium and community practice focused on integrated approaches to water, energy, food, biodiversity, and planetary health in the global south. His work connects policy, science, and practice to enhance UNU-INWEH's impact and visibility. Professor Mabhaudhi also holds the position of Professor of Climate Change, Food Systems, and Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and is director of the Institute for Natural Resources in South Africa. Previously, Professor Mabhaudhi held the position of Research Group Leader for Sustainable and Resilient Food Systems at the International Water Management Institute. Professor Mabhaudhi also plays strategic roles on various advisory committees and panels and is an editor for several high-impact journals. And I think it's a particularly exciting day for us to welcome Professor Mabhaudhi here, as just yesterday, the Lancet Countdown announced the launch of their African Regional Center, and Professor Mabhaudhi will lead as the newly appointed director. And the center is going to drive vital regional research on the health impacts of climate change across Africa, helping to fill critical gaps and support evidence-based policy. This builds on Professor Mabhaudhi's exceptional leadership with the intersection of climate change, food systems, and public health, both at UNU and at a range of other institutes. And today he'll be sharing his insights on co-developing integrated water, energy, food, plus nexus scenarios using a people-centered and data-informed framework that bridges the gap between theory and practice. And now it is my great honor and pleasure to turn it over to you, Professor Mabhaudhi.
Thank you very much, Miriam, for the warm introduction. I'm really pleased to be here today. This is my second UNU Science Talk. So thank you very much for inviting me again. Usually if you do a bad job, you don't get the second invite. So if I don't get an invite next year, then I'll know that this was a bad job. Yeah, but so thank you very much. I will share my presentation that I'll be doing today. So I'll be talking about work that we have been doing as a research group across several institutions that I work and collaborate with, that is focused on co-developing integrative water, energy, food, plus nexus scenarios. We've added the plus to the WEF more recently because there have been a lot of calls to broaden the nexus to include other dimensions such as environment, health, climate, land, and so forth. And what we've basically come down to is an understanding to say at the center is really the three dimensions: water, energy, and food. And the calls to broaden it are just demonstrating its relevance and interlinkages to multiple other systems. So we've basically then just said WEF plus, the plus denoting that there is potential to interlink it to several other systems beyond just the 3 primary ones mentioned in the Nexus. So just as a background to this work started back around 2012, and we initially built this work around a goal that was really driven by a resource securities perspective, where we were focused mostly on water, energy, and food security. That was the primary, outcome that we were looking towards in terms of the Nexus. We were trying to respond to integrated challenges around climate change, its impacts that it was having on resource securities, primarily water, energy, and food, the growing challenge of environmental degradation, and the amplification that population increase or growth was having across these challenge domains. So we saw the Nexus being very strongly linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, mostly because of its direct linkage to SDGs 2, 6, and 7, as well as 13 and 15. And at the core of the Nexus is the emphasis on partnership, collaboration, and coordination, cross-sectoral management, which speaks to SDG 17. So these are direct linkages to at least 6 SDGs, with other indirect linkages to multiple SDGs. And as I said, initially we took a very resource-centric approach to our understanding of the Nexus, where we focus mostly on the natural resource base and understanding of how do we manage these resources equitably, and also how do we manage them sustainably in order to improve efficiencies, in order to improve access, in order to improve utilization. But over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of criticism to the Nexus approach as it was originally, in that it was resource-centric, as I've mentioned. And there's been a focus to consider other dimensions, such as environmental health, looking at the societal outcomes. So we then also added this lens of environmental welfare and societal welfare to our work on the Nexus, or the Nexus thinking approach that we were looking at. So this also then broadened the outcome areas that we were looking at beyond just water, energy, and food security, to also include resilience and adaptation, and improved human and environmental health. So focusing now on these 3 interlinked outcome areas, one which is around improved resource securities, one which is around climate change resilience, and then another one which is around improved human and environmental health. We then focused on what we are now calling the people and planet-centric Nexus approach. Now, building on that, we have done a lot of work, some of which I presented in my presentation last year, on developing models for modeling the WEF Nexus. But the main challenge regarding these models is they were all static. They could only assess the status quo and tell us the status of the Nexus at a particular instance. And this limited the sort of decisions that we wanted to make, where we had to look into the future and be able to analyze what if and how kind of situations, to say what if we then took decisions differently, what would be the outcome on the Nexus. So we then moved into visioning future and alternative states, thinking around scenarios and pathways. Now, scenarios and pathways are 2 different things. Sometimes the 2 words get used interchangeably, but technically they mean very different things. So your scenarios are just combinations of quantitative pathways. So you're actually taking a combination, a set of pathways, and that are either quantitative or qualitative, and combining them to look at future possibilities or states of the world. So they are mostly a what if kind of questions. Then you've got pathways. Pathways, as the word denotes, are looking at trajectories or certain directions for which future conditions could move towards under a single component. So you're taking one element and then looking at how a direction could evolve based on that. And that is usually looking at alternative strategies, different ways of doing business. So we've got different kinds of pathways and we've got different types of scenarios. Now, the thing that we wanted to do in this is to develop scenarios which are combinations of pathways. And so we looked at the different pathways that are there. And our question was, how can we integrate these sectoral pathways that are mostly developed within silos or for specific sector uses and integrate them to come up with what could be water, energy, food plus nexus scenarios. So that's the integrated scenarios, but also taking into consideration the focus on people and planetary health centric outcomes. Now, looking at those, building on that and looking at the different scenario typologies versus principal questions about the possible future or what we were looking at. The principal questions that we would look at in terms of scenario typologies is scenarios can either be predictive, where they are looking at possible futures, probable futures based on current trends or ongoing changes. They can be explorative, especially where we are trying to respond to situations of significant uncertainty, such as climate change and other things that are emerging currently in the world, in the political economy, much uncertainty to do there. Or normative, which is where we are basically interested in the achievement of a defined vision or targets. So normative would be, for example, where you are considering achievement of the SDGs, because the SDGs are a clear set of a defined vision. Or in the African context, we could be looking at Agenda 2063. It's a clearly defined vision. So you can have normative scenarios, they can be explorative, where you're trying to manage uncertainty, or they can be predictive, where you are trying to just look at probable futures and see how things will go based on current and emerging trends. So what we did at the beginning in terms of our methodology was to first understand what is actually at play, this existing state of knowledge in terms of developing scenarios and pathways. So the first step was basically undertaking a systematic review of the literature, where we conducted a systematic literature review, looking at identifying literature that describes frameworks around scenario development, pathways, the different scales, both spatial and temporal, what sort of analytical tools, what steps and procedures, because we wanted to understand how scenarios have been developed, either in sectors or in other integrated areas. We then used this information through a process of engagement with different stakeholders, mostly in Southern Africa, in the Nkomati-Usuthu catchment, which is a transboundary catchment. Through a process of consultation and engagement, we then used this to develop a generic, people-centered and data-driven methodological framework with clear guidelines. And we then took this generic framework back into another consultative period where we took it back to the experts who had initially assisted us to develop it, sort of a validation exercise. We also did multiple validations. We took it to a symposium, the WaterNet Symposium. We took it to one of our WEF Nexus advanced schools that we do, and we also subjected it to an expert panel to get more feedback to revise that framework. So this is the framework that I'll be sharing with you today, as well as the steps that we have taken to develop this framework for WEF plus Nexus scenarios. So just in terms of the status of knowledge, as I mentioned, what we did at the beginning was to look at the state of knowledge in terms of, what elements have been considered in WEF Nexus scenario planning. So this just provides a summary of the different elements that, we found in terms of applied scenario planning in WEF Nexus. As you can see, not a very strong focus on people and planetary, centered methodological frameworks and guidelines. And this has always been a major criticism in the Nexus approach to date, the lack of a clear focus on people and environmental outcomes. And then we also looked at which set of scenarios have been integrated, looking at the CMIP6, as well as the representative agricultural pathways and others. So again, it was just to basically understand what is the status of knowledge out there, what has been done, to what extent, and what are the gaps in knowledge. So this was the status as of January when we did this analysis. Now, I adopted this framework for thinking or conceptualizing scenarios, which has been developed by the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, IASA, in terms of how do we move from an understanding of the current situation. We always talk about business as usual. Business as usual in the context of the WEF Nexus is referring to silo mentality and the continuation of silos, which then create trade-offs. And we are wanting to shift away from that current trend into a new situation or a desired situation where we amplify synergies and we mitigate trade-offs. So that new situation then gives rise to different scenarios or different probable or possible futures. And in this case, we are looking at 3 probable futures that emanate or that diverge from trying to mitigate or manage trade-offs and maximize on synergies. So this is just a framework for engaging that we use for stakeholder engagement and co-developing these scenarios. Now, what came out, as I mentioned, after the initial, the desktop survey and the public engagement, stakeholder engagement that we did, was the key drivers of change that were identified and agreed were socioeconomic vulnerabilities. That includes poverty, inequality, unemployment, and vulnerabilities to climate change. Climate change itself as a driver, environmental degradation as another driver of change, and then governance, the focus on institutions. And this is speaking more towards the need for cross-sectoral coordination, collaboration, and partnership, as well as policy coherence. So we clustered that under governance. So there were 4 dimensions or 4 key drivers of change that were identified. We then looked at which, sort of pathways we could combine to develop these integrated WEF Nexus scenarios. The pathways that we identified were for climate change. We identified the SSPs and the RCPs, which are already integrated themselves, the shared socioeconomic pathways and the RCPs. The RAPs, those are the agricultural pathways. And then we also considered policies, and out of the analysis of policies was then considering planned interventions. Again, this was also informed by stakeholder input in terms of identifying policies and planned interventions in the key water, energy, and food sectors. In terms of the WEF Nexus variables, indicators, and inputs, this is where we then start integrating our modeling approaches in terms of then combining the socioeconomic, the climate, future, and historic, as well as looking at the supply and demand or the consumption of the WEF resources, water, energy, food resource base, and fitting that into our models, the models that we have, whether they are integrated assessment models or modular models that we are then coupling together and running them, or driving them rather through these WEF Nexus scenarios. So that's the framework, the first iteration of the framework that we developed based on the desktop survey and stakeholder input that we conducted. Now, looking at what sort of processes we can then use, typical processes for co-planning or co-developing WEF Nexus scenarios. Again, ours was different in that not only did it involve researchers and stakeholders, it also involved parts of civil society and communities, which helped us to better understand the current situation. It also helped us to better understand the different visions of the different stakeholders, the policy visions, the practitioner visions, the community visions, and in better understanding that context of the different visions within the same location, in this case, within the same catchment, the transboundary catchment, we were able to then co-develop an integrated Nexus modeling framework based on combining the different pathways that I highlighted in the previous framework. Again, now looking at the generic people-centered framework and how it then iterated through the stakeholder consultations that I mentioned, that we then took it through a validation phase and further consultation with different stakeholder groups. We identified 6 key steps that are necessary for co-developing these WEF Nexus scenarios. Step 1 is the mapping of stakeholders and basically the building of a shared understanding, which is understanding the different perspectives, the different needs, the different visions, and then coming up to one shared vision that is a compromise and best represents or reflects the needs of everyone within the particular geography. Again, what this means is this process has to be done repeatedly for different geographical locations. That's why we then focus on a framework rather than actual scenarios, because within different contexts, the vision would differ. Within different contexts, the problem would differ. So it's very important to then have a stepwise process to it. So after building a shared vision and understanding, the next step would be defining what the problem is and then fitting the problem or scoping the problem within the WEF Nexus system. How does it relate to dimensions of the WEF and the broader dimensions? In most cases, you will find that the problem fits into the broader dimensions because the problem usually is not directly linked to the resource base itself, but is located more in the outcome areas. So you'll find if you talk to politicians, they would tell you that the problem is lack of employment, the problem is increasing levels of poverty or rising inequality. If you talk to people at a community level, they would usually define the problem in terms of access and availability, that we lack access to this is not available. If you talk to practitioners, they'll usually define the problem in terms of implementation, the challenges in delivering on certain outcomes. So depending on the different stakeholder groups, again, you need to define the problem and scope it correctly. Mostly you're going to have to come from an outcomes-based perspective and link those outcomes that the different stakeholder groups are trying to achieve into the resource base, into the nexus itself. And then after you've done that, is to then go back now and identify the basic WEF scenario elements and variables that you would need to develop scenarios. As I mentioned, what are the different pathways? What is the data availability that you need? And that is the step that you need to iterate again to go back and see whether you need to review or revise the question, the problem that you've set out at the beginning, and then you come back again. So it's an iterative process in that respect. Then you move now into the actual co-developing of the different scenarios, and first with understanding what is the business as usual scenario, what is currently happening, what is the situation, and then what are the alternative scenarios, what are the probable futures that we would need to move towards, and then reflecting and those results of all WEF Nexus scenarios and discussing them or sharing them with different stakeholder groups. So you see that from steps 2 to 6, there is a lot of iteration in terms of forward and backward linkages that you need to take. And that is just the exhaustiveness of stakeholder engagement and consultation. So from a phased approach, you would be looking at 3 phases, which is 1, initiation, and you can call that building of a shared understanding. The second stage is the core development and validation of your business as usual and alternative or WEF Nexus scenarios. And then the third phase is dissemination of the findings. And we are currently now at the third phase of disseminating this framework. The next stage that we are going to be moving at in this research is actually the quantitative aspect of combining the different data sets into the actual scenarios. So the different applications that we are looking at for the Southern African region where this work has been driven, and as I mentioned, the initial analysis has been done within a transboundary water catchment. So we're looking at how do we then deploy the scenario, these different scenarios that we are developing for transboundary water management, as well as informing WEF Nexus investments for different sectors and optimizing basin-wide benefits. So we are targeting the Nkomati Usutu catchment management area. We are also looking at the Songwe River Basin, where they already have a business plan that has been backed by the African Development Bank. And we want to see how across the different areas that are being planned, what are the synergistic areas, what are the entry points, what optimizes what in terms of the planned projects or planned investments, which ones should we focus on that provide the maximal benefits. So this is just looking at, different scenarios, a business as usual scenario, an SDG where you're focusing on the SDGs, and then an SDG cooperative kind of assessment. And you can see in terms of how the benefits increase when you focus on integration in the SDG, where you envision around the SDGs. as opposed to a business as usual kind of approach. You then get more or optimize benefits across the different outcome areas or across the different focal areas that one would be targeting. This is just the case of, the Songwe River Basin that I was talking about, where again, it's looking in terms of how do you optimize and plan for robust and resilient infrastructure under climate change. So here we are considering issues such as integrated storage and basin management, how through improved water access and availability, as well as linking that to energy generation, you can enable increased water access through increased economic distribution of water, as well as through increased ability to irrigate and produce food. And this is an ongoing initiative in Malawi, and we are currently now through another Wellcome-funded project initiating a new case study focused on the Shira River Basin in Malawi, where there is a massive irrigation program or irrigation scheme that has been launched there by the government of Malawi. And again, we are going to be undertaking consultation there to refine the scenarios and try and inform the planning there in terms of what sort of interventions or investments would provide the best outcomes or would maximize outcomes across the need to produce hydroelectricity in the catchment, maintain environmental flows so that energy generation and irrigation does not occur at the expense of ecosystem health, but also enhances ecosystem health. And we're looking at those scenarios again, coming from a business as usual baseline and looking at how do we optimize those different outcomes. This is another example that we are also looking to adopt in terms of the deployment of scenarios or scenario planning in terms of assessing policies. So you can also use these scenarios once developed to test and assess policies in terms of whether policy coherence would actually achieve better outcomes. So in the last presentation that I did, I shared a similar spider diagram as this, where outwards movement towards the boundaries shows greater nexus sustainability. And so what you are seeing is that the current business as usual, which is focused mostly on hydro energy, power and energy production, is creating trade-offs in the system. That's the blue line. So the business as usual scenario is creating significant trade-offs. If we move towards a more integrated nexus-based planning, which means we've got more integrated policies, better coherence and coordination, you can start to see the amoeba shape changing and us moving more closer towards the boundaries of the spider diagram and towards greater sustainability and better nexus outcomes. So again, there's application of these scenarios in the policy analysis and coherence assessment for the nexus. This is also then looking at the technical adaptation and mitigation. So again, as I mentioned in the first slide, that one of the outcome areas that we are looking at is looking at, climate building resilience to climate change. And often we talk about maladaptation or trade-offs in general when adaptation is not very well planned and leads to, massive trade-offs. And basically, you can apply this sort of assessment or analysis to be able to test adaptation and mitigation strategies against socioeconomic outcomes and climate change, and then be able to see which combination or which strategies produce a more desired or a more balanced outcome in terms of nexus outcomes, integrated interventions, and so forth. So this is one area, again, where we are looking to be able to deploy these Nexus scenarios that we are co-developing. Groundwater is another important area that we are interested in because the extent of groundwater quantification has not been done very well, especially in Southern Africa and most of Africa. We don't know how much groundwater we have, and we have been tapping into groundwater as an adaptation strategy to increase access to water for irrigation as well as access to water for other uses. But we are also mindful and aware of the trade-offs that have happened in places such as India, where the promotion of solar-based irrigation led to over-abstraction of groundwater and salinification of the soil, creating other environmental problems. So we want to be able to see and apply or deploy these WEF Nexus scenarios in terms of groundwater governance and management to come up with optimal situations that create synergies rather than trade-offs in terms of groundwater use under climate change or as an adaptation strategy. So in conclusion, in terms of the framework that I shared, that we have developed for WEF Nexus scenarios, the importance of these scenarios, if co-developed through an iterative and stakeholder-driven process, is that it allows for anticipation, planning, and preparation, and also to take strategic decisions for future alternative states, as I gave in those examples. We have tried to be transdisciplinary, that is to include all stakeholders, not just scientists, but to also include policy and decision makers, to include practitioners, civil society, and community members, to build that shared understanding and vision, and also to build a shared or commonly agreed to problem, the problem identification, as well as the priorities and the development of the alternative or probable futures that we would want to aspire to. So it is a transdisciplinary process that facilitates co-development, co-implementation, and co-evaluation of the Nexus scenarios. From what we have understood so far, is it's also promoting uptake and better translation of the WEF Nexus approach, and therefore facilitating its movement or its transition from theory towards more of policy and practical outcomes. We tested the thinking again of these scenarios at a recent workshop in March in Addis Ababa, where we were reviewing or where we're talking about how the WEF Nexus approach can help to accelerate progress towards achieving the SDGs and how it can interlink or synergize multiple other SDGs beyond the 5 that it is directly linked to. So again, in that instance, we were deploying it as a discourse tool to facilitate policy discussion. The outcome of that was an action list that was co-developed by the member states, which then prioritized actions and interventions from a Nexus perspective that the countries are going to focus on, and which we will now support in terms of building an investment case. So that is now moving it again into practice. So that's one of the usefulness of this process of co-developing and also co-implementing these Nexus scenarios. So the recommendations that we have so far, as I mentioned, this is still work in progress that we have been undertaking for the last 4 years. So currently the recommendations is adopting a people and planet-centered approach really helps in terms of building buy-in from different stakeholders. As I mentioned, often the interest of stakeholders is not located directly within the Nexus resources, but is more in the outcome spaces, what tends to be achieved. So therefore, having a people and planet-centered framework helps you to be able to harness that information and to convert the nexus from being resource or input-centric into more outcomes-based, and hence increasing its relevance for people and planetary outcomes. It is important to engage a range of stakeholders, both experts and non-experts, as it informs a broader vision with broader buy-in from across different sectors and different parts of society. We want to consider to update, we used the CMIP5, so we want to update our current scenarios with CMIP6, so that is currently in process, as well as a more detailed analysis of the representative agricultural pathways. We hope to be able to apply these. So far, we've applied them at a transboundary scale in the Nkomati Usutu, and we're also hoping to apply them locally in the Shire River Basin in Malawi for the case study we are doing there. But we also want to explore maybe city level analysis, how we can inform city level planning around the resilient cities concept, and how to then apply them at, for tactical and operational planning horizons. So far, we have deployed them for strategic, which is long-term planning horizons. We need to shorten that to tactical, which is mid-term, and operational, which is short-term. And if we can do that again, it will increase the relevance of the Nexus approach and its utility for day-to-day decision-making. So that brings me to the end of this presentation. That's, the class of 2024 for the Water Energy Food Nexus Advanced School in Southern Africa. They also contributed to one of the validation steps of the Nexus scenarios. And hopefully, again, this year through the next advanced school, which will be in August, we'll be able to, further validate and improve through these engagements. So thank you very much, and a big thank you to the team that is behind this work. My team based in South Africa, who do most of this work, the number crunching, going to the field, and the stakeholder engagement. Thank you very much. Back to you, Miriam.
Thank you so much, Professor Mabhaudhi, for really, really interesting presentation and really fantastic, important work. I remind our attendees that you can put your questions in the Q&A box, and I will read them out to our speaker. Just to kick off, I was really interested by how you started first by the need to define the problem and how all of the different stakeholders have their own particular issue, and the first step is really defining the problem that we're trying to move towards. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, from a governance perspective, what are some of the biggest challenges in terms of actually integrating the WEF plus scenarios in decision making, especially for transboundary or multi-jurisdictional contexts?
So thanks very much. That's a very good question. So I'll just give you an example. In that room where you're sitting, Kaveh is probably thinking, how do I keep this show going on for the next couple of years? That's his vision, and that's the challenge that he's looking at. Someone could be thinking, what's for lunch today? That's the problem and time frame that they are looking at to say, how am I going to put lunch together? Someone could be thinking, how do I secure printing paper for the printers? And that's a problem that is real to them. So when you work with different stakeholders, you've got people who are dealing with different problems and different timeframes. And so that's why building that shared understanding is very important, because you want to connect everyone on the same path to say, Kaveh's vision of keeping the show going for the long term is necessary for everyone to be there. And if everyone is there, then it becomes important that they have a working space that is healthy, where they can have lunch, and for them to be productive and do their work and be able to print and so forth. So none of those three problems are separate. They are actually part and parcel of the same problem. And we need to address them conjunctively. So that part of getting people to agree and converge that their problems, different as they may seem, are actually one problem that needs to be addressed in an integrated manner. And then also understanding that we can't shoot at all three. We have, and that's where systems, helps us to then say, where do we attack this big problem from? So now when you've got that shared vision and a shared understanding of the problem, what it helps is if you come up with a solution that maybe looks like it is entering, or the entry point is Miriam as entry point, Kaveh and the other person do not feel like their interests are no longer being addressed, because now they understand that we are in this together. And if that happens in that sector, it's going to unlock this for me and this for me. So now you've reached a point of compromise. So usually the challenges emanate from, one, us not understanding things the same way, two, us not believing that we have similar problems, three, us thinking that my problem is bigger than yours and therefore should be a priority. And therefore, I'm not going to work with you to solve your problem whilst my problem is not being addressed. So you do yours, I'll do mine, we'll meet each other somewhere. So that's why steps 1 and 2 are very important.
Thank you.
As a follow-up to that, I'm just curious, is it that simple to achieve consensus like we just described in reality?
It's the Nexus is not about consensus building. It's about compromise. It's hard to achieve consensus, a point where everyone agrees, but you want to move towards, compromise. So there are going to be winners and losers. But the most important thing is to reach a compromise where those who might be losing or who feel like they are losing today also understand the long term, where they stand to win in the long term, that they are not going to be losing throughout. There's a point where they are going to gain. That's the understanding of synergies, to say, where are we going to enhance and multiply the gains for you? Or in some times, it's about saying, how are we going to minimize the losses for you? Maybe a loss is inevitable, but what we can manage is to minimize that loss and the impact of those losses, especially in the climate change space. The impacts will be there, but when we talk about resilience, it's about how do we reduce or minimize the loss when that impact comes. So I think more in terms of compromise than consensus.
We have an audience question. Tumaini Wambua says, thank you for the excellent presentation, Professor Tafadzwa. Regarding scenarios, could you please reflect on how the WEF Plus mechanism can either galvanize or hinder operationalizing IPCC targets and goals, particularly in the Global South?
Thanks very much. So from a WEF Plus scenarios thinking, we then think of integrating across the different frameworks. So that's part of the work that we've been doing, to look at how do we integrate the UNFCCC frameworks, the UNCBD frameworks, and the UNCCD frameworks. So I'll give you an example. In Africa, the biggest driver of greenhouse gas emissions in Africa is land use change. And land use change is driving greenhouse gas emissions, it's driving environmental degradation, it's leading to reduced crop yields and productivity. So from a climate change and IPCC perspective, they're thinking of mitigation, which is how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The driver is land use. Where land use is addressed, it's addressed in the UNCCD, the land neutrality goal that speaks specifically to the issue of land degradation, halting further land degradation. If we halt further land degradation and we rehabilitate and restore that land, we encourage return of biodiversity. We encourage the land to become a carbon sink again, and we move back into reducing emissions. So what the Nexus scenarios tell us or then facilitate is the understanding that some of the goals of the IPCC cannot be achieved solely through the IPCC or UNFCCC related frameworks. There is need to engage and break the climate silo, engage with biodiversity, engage with the UNCCD processes, and maybe other actors who then, through those actions that provide synergies, can contribute to outcomes that will be then measured in the IPCC processes.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Tafadzwa. Very nice presentation. My question is, when you say WEF plus, where is the plus for first and second? And then you said people-centric and data-driven. And which part of your methodology is more important in the process, the data part or people's part?
Okay, thanks very much for the question. So the plus is, there are many iterations of the Nexus. So we talk water, energy, food. There's water, energy, food, ecosystems or environment. Others now talk about water, energy, food, environment, health. Some say water, energy, food, land. Some will say water, energy, food, climate, or water, energy, food, gender. So there are all these iterations. But what we are saying is, at the core are these three resources: water, energy, and food, and how they connect into these different other systems, be it environment, be it gender, be it health, climate. So the plus is representing that it links into many other dimensions. So for simplicity, instead of having multiple acronyms, we are proposing that let's just say WEF plus and other things. And then in terms of the framework, people and data-driven, I would say if we're to place an emphasis, I would place it on people, the consultation, because at the end of the day, decisions are political and politicians are people, and they mostly respond to people outcomes because that's where they derive their mandate. The data is important from a science perspective because that is where we establish rigor and robustness. But there's always going to be a compromise because in many regions, there is data poverty. We are not going to be able to find data sets that we need to drive our models. So sometimes we have to work with estimates or just expert opinion to say this is this, this is that. So I would put it second, because if you don't have the people, then you're not going to have the experts to make up for when you've got data scarcity.
Thank you.
And you've gotten a number of comments as well, commending your excellent and informative presentation. And Aiden says, thank you for such an interesting presentation. Can you briefly comment on the transferability of these co-developed WEF plus Nexus models from one locality to another?
So thanks very much. So as I mentioned, the transferability is in the framework. That's why we've focused more on the framework, because it's a process, it's the approach that matters, those 6 steps that I mentioned. The content is going to vary across different locations because of how people, will shape their vision. So the vision is always then going to define what the problem actually becomes and what is the situation, which is the business as usual, and what are the desired outcomes. So the framework is what is transferable, in that if you undertake those steps, it can lead you into integrated scenarios. The scenarios are going to differ for each location depending on the vision, but you can generally rely on the same data sets. Like we've used climate data, we've used the representative agricultural pathways and so forth. But how you then combine them in terms of the probable futures, that is going to be informed by steps 1 and 2. So my emphasis would be take the framework and apply it. That is transferable.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tafadzwa, for the great presentation. I have more of a philosophical question, maybe. So what you're presenting is a trade-off analysis, right? And trade-off analysis has been done in many different ways, and sometimes with participants and stakeholders and so on. And there's a community out there who have been doing this for decades. So what's special about Nexus here? So what does the word, this phrase, which is very hot and attractive these days, what is that offering? What's the new insight that is brought in by the use of word Nexus, or by renaming or rebranding? Is there a change? Has this been a tool to attract the attention of the stakeholders? They like the term Nexus and they don't like the term trade-off. So what's so special about it?
There's nothing special about the Nexus per se. I would not say the Nexus is special. The thinking of the Nexus is very old. The literature on Nexus thinking dates back to around 2000 and so. It's just that it became prominent around 2011 because the World Economic Forum adopted it in one of their reports and then said, the WEF Nexus. And subsequent to that, we then had the SDGs with the emphasis on being integrated. And there's been a whole push towards more systems thinking, or systems approaches towards solving complex problems. So the Nexus has been around. But what I would say is the trade-off analysis, systems thinking, and any approach that is able to tackle complexity has become more relevant now than it was before, mostly because of the increasing complexity of the challenges that today's society is trying to deal with, and the transferability of problems across systems, which has challenged the traditional approaches of dealing with individual systems or developing interventions within particular systems or within particular geographies or within particular temporal scales. So our understanding of complexity, how complexity cascades temporal and spatial scales, and how it also cascades systems, is what has brought us to where we are now advocating Nexus approaches or systems approaches. So the WEF Nexus or Nexus thinking fits within that movement that is calling for systems approaches. That's essentially it.
But so then here's the question: is it the systems thinking, systems thinking resulted in promotion of Nexus, or it was the other way around? That's another, I would say, interesting discussion. But then I have a question about this WEF Nexus, or what, is that contradictory? Because if you're talking about Nexus, then we are talking about systems, right? We are talking about complexity and the interaction, interrelated dynamics and dependencies of all these different systems. But the moment we narrow down again to water, food, energy, then we are narrowing down superficially, right? And that's against the term Nexus, because then we're saying expand. And we know that the problems of water, energy, food cannot be solved within the water, food, energy systems, right? So you have the issue of employment, you have health, you have and that's why there's one community or one group who does water energy nexus, another one does water energy food climate, as you said, and we see all these terms. So how do we deal with that sort of contradictory message? Because, you know, the moment you narrow down, you're working against the term nexus.
Yeah, so to answer the first question, systems thinking gave birth to nexus thinking. When we talk about the WEF Nexus in particular, it is located within socio-ecological systems thinking. So it's systems thinking, socio-ecological systems thinking that has given rise to this. To the second question of, are we narrowing it down? We are not narrowing it down. We are actually, which is the focus of another ongoing paper that we are writing, titled Broadening the Dimensions of the Nexus. So the nexus has traditionally been narrowed down. At the beginning, it was narrowed down to just, in this particular case, water, energy, and food, because they were the three primary dimensions that had the greatest linkages to socio-economic and political outcomes. But it did not mean that they were the only dimensions. As you mentioned, you've got people then joining doors to other things. And what that highlights is the interdependencies and interlinkages to multiple other systems. But from a modeling perspective, there is a limit to how many variables when we are doing modeling that we can take. So the idea with a WEF plus nexus thinking is to say, if we are looking at integrating, if we make these three the core of the nexus, and then we have all these others in a constellation going around or orbiting around this core, from a modeling perspective, these others that are in the orbit are sort of modules, plug-in modules. So when you're doing analysis, depending on what your interests are, we should be able to then plug in a module on environment, plug in a module on health, or plug in a module on economics, depending on what your interest is and what sort of decisions or research questions that you have. So that's just a thinking in terms of the quantification or the modeling aspects of the nexus.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much again, Professor Mabhaudhi. And again, congratulations on the launch of the African Regional Center. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. We're delighted to have you here, and we can assure you that you will be welcomed back again for another presentation. So we'd be honored to have you again.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.